such a wide-ranging panel of experts. It's also an honor to serve with Darian and the team on the California Target book as an editor. I'll introduce the panel briefly and then we'll get right to it. First off, we have the Honorable Kristen Olson. Kristen serves on the Stanislaus County Board of Supervisors, as well as serves on the Board of California Women Lead, a bipartisan organization that seeks to elect and appoint women across the state. She also runs her own consulting firm, Red Suit. She previously served as a Republican leader, as we all know, and also on the Modesto City Council. We have Richard Temple. Richard is the Executive Vice President at McNally Temple & Associates, responsible for survey, research, polling analysis, and strategic planning. He has over 30 years of experience in government and public relations. Marty Wilson, the Great. Marty is the Executive Vice President of Public Affairs of the California Chamber of Commerce. He has over 40 years experience in California politics, playing roles in the election and re-election of 2 governors and a U.S. Senator, and has orchestrated numerous successful ballot measures and public affairs campaigns. And he's a very formidable adversary to the labor movement for sure. So I know his team is here. Pleasure to serve with him. And of course, Bill Wong, who is one of the key architects for the Assembly Speaker. Bill Wong is a consultant that specializes in helping clients overcome complex policy and political challenges with precisely executed aggressive, creative, and asymmetric tactics and strategies. His firm advised large employers, labor organizations, political action committees, and candidates for local, state, and federal office. So thank you all for being here. Our first question is going to be to, in terms of protocol, to the elected official, only elected official of the bunch. And this is going to be sort of a recap. As a former Republican leader, how do you think Republicans fared in the primary, and how can they improve that performance in the general?
So I think for many of us, maybe most of us in the room, Republicans fared far better in the primary than we thought they would do. Certainly they did better than I thought they would do, which speaks to a few issues, and they could have done even better. I think in order for the Republican Party to do better, because I think the primary did show there is potential, as laughable as this may have seemed to some of us a month ago, and maybe some of you still today, there is potential for the Republican Party to become a powerful balancing force in California again. And I think the primary showed that. A lot of people have written over the last few weeks about how NPPs are growing as Republican numbers are dropping, and yet many have written that doesn't mean that people in those NPP categories aren't still leaning either Republican or Democrat. What it does show is they're fed up with both parties. And the Republicans have a lot of soul searching to do in order to figure out how to grow and become a powerful balancing force once again. And I think in order to do so, one, they have to recruit candidates. Candidate recruitment is extraordinarily difficult, something I never realized until I was Republican leader in the state assembly, but they really have to have an aggressive recruiting arm. Second, the primary showed we have to begin to coalesce around a candidate. That's not easy to do. This is something that's been difficult for both Republicans and Democrats, as the primary has shown. But when you have 20 some odd candidates running for a single seat, nobody knows who any of them are, and you're just leaving the outcome to chance. Had the party coalesced around a candidate, promoted a candidate, there's a very good, a better than not chance that we would have had somebody in the top 2 for the lieutenant governor's race and for the U.S. Senate race. And ultimately, that's important for down ticket races, if nothing else. The third thing that Republican Party must do, that I've been saying for a very long time, is the party has to, and its candidates have to begin to demonstrate that they really care about people, that they want to see people's lives get better. And then number 2, they have to advance solutions, real workable solutions to the pressing problems that are facing our state and to the cost of living that is so harmful to so many Californians. If the party can do all of those things, recruit candidates, coalesce around candidates, begin to advance solutions and show we care about people, there is an opportunity to have a viable, healthy 2-party system even in California again. And I am a firm believer in a healthy, robust 2-party system that improves the quality of life for everyone. In the general election, what I would say we could do in the general election, I don't know that we could improve. I would say if we maintain the results from the primary, it will be a glowingly positive year for the Republican Party. Turnout will be higher, so that will be a tremendous challenge. But if we can win the seats in the general that the party won in the primary, that will be a solid year for Republicans that most people, including myself, frankly, didn't predict.
So we're going to switch it up here. As you know, Bill Wong has the sort of responsibility here of carrying the Democrats, in on this panel. So we're going to ask him. Democrats did overall fairly well, even though it wasn't an overwhelming blue wave of voters. Do you see a need for the Democrats to revise their messaging to general election voters? And if so, in which districts?
Yeah, I mean, I think they need to revise their messaging in general. And I also think that they need to revise how they deliver it. I was down there for the Newman recall, and there were piles of, and on both sides, there's piles of mail that were just sitting on either on the porch or in the mailboxes. And I think the one takeaway from this, the June primary, is that the voters are very disengaged. They weren't answering phones. If you're using predictive dialers, the connect rate was really low. People really didn't feel like answering doors. In fact, when I was walking precincts, they had taped messages on the door saying, "Go away, unless you're police or fire or delivery man, go away." I mean, I think that, even though we did pretty well, I think that that's the canary in the coal mine, in the sense that clearly we're not connecting with voters, and if we don't address that going into November, we're going to be in deep trouble.
I think with all the marches and all the activity and all the sort of activism on social media, we all expected a larger turnout and more enthusiasm for voters, and somebody mentioned earlier, intensity of voters as well. This question is for Marty Wilson. So a lot of it had to do with the Trump factor. So how do Republicans handle candidates? How do Republican candidates handle the Trump factor in swing districts?
Well, it's always a challenge for any Republican running in California. It doesn't seem to matter when there's a Republican in the White House, which one it is. They don't seem to play very well in California. We certainly saw that with Bush, George W. Bush, 41. So I think that the challenge, and to me how do you overcome the quote unquote Trump factor, and the solution is you agree with him where you agree, and but you reserve the right to disagree. And what we've seen in our polling is voters really want candidates, and I think it goes to Kristen's point and even Bill's point a little bit, is voters really want candidates that are talking about solutions. And they're kind of tired of all the rhetoric. I think Trump is exhausting. I mean, I think he's exhausted the body politic and certainly the voters. And so I think that they're tired of the fighting, and so it's more of a message, where I agree with him, we'll work together, and where I disagree with him, I reserve the right to disagree with Trump and his policies.
So this kind of follows up for Richard Temple. How clear is the California path for the BCCC to flip seats in Congress, and which ones and why?
Well, first of all, I think that they were very clever and very strategic, and I think that helped them and increase their odds of being successful in the races for Congress, in a way that they got involved in the primaries in a way that, I've been doing this a long time, was never so direct, unabashedly and unashamed, and had zero consequences. They were able to decide who they wanted to run against in two congressional races, which I think they put almost $4 million trying to get a better opponent to face in the general election. They were successful, and the Republicans were unprepared. They were outthought and outfought on those two particular races. So I think that in particular, the 49th down in San Diego, I think is going to be a difficult lift for the Republicans. I think that's probably the greatest opportunity for Democrats to pick up. But on the other hand, I think that their appetite is a lot larger than they're going to be ability to eat, because I think that these races, these districts, are not that bad for Republicans, in particular in a gubernatorial election. The big question going into this election for most of us is, was there going to be some dramatic difference in behavior by voters because of Trump and the excitement going on for the people who don't like him? And what we've seen in the primary is it isn't dramatically different. There are places where it was higher, and other places where it was just the same. And so, to Marty's point, I think everybody's just too tired. There's no room for anything but Trump and DC, and there's no room for races here in California for their attention. So I believe that they're going to be less successful here than they think. I think that they can pick up maybe 2. I don't see a larger margin than that. So I think that's the way I see it as of now. We'll see how things change in the next few months.
So I'm going to throw an open question here to see if whoever wants to answer it, because I think a lot of people are wondering what happened in AD 76. Phil Gramm was supposed to be in the runoff, right?
Right.
Maybe? Does anybody want to handle that one?
Yeah, well, Richard and I worked on that one together, so it was really McNally Temple's fault. But no, I think that there's 3 factors there that clearly contributed to the success for the Democratic Party. First off, the Republicans had 5 or 6 candidates, and nobody knew who any of these people were. I mean, we polled down there, and candidates were getting like 3% and 5% of the vote in our early benchmarks, except for one. And the one is a Democratic candidate who happens to have the name of Elizabeth Warren. Everybody wanted to vote for Elizabeth Warren. I don't know why, but anyway, they did. And so she had this kind of intrinsic name ID advantage, and ironically, the Democratic establishment and the activists in that community, they preferred another candidate by the name of Tasha Horvath, who's on Encinitas City Council. So they've got 2 Democrats, one holds elective office, the other's named Elizabeth Warren. The Republicans got a bunch of people out there running, but nobody has any name ID advantage or anything else. But in our polling, what we saw was that Phil Gramm, based on his endorsements and his strength as a candidate and his money, should make the runoff. But he had a little problem, and I think that in that he was hanging out in a bar rather late at night, and I told my kids nothing good happens after midnight, and I said the same thing to Phil. So, that was water under the bridge. But he created an issue where one didn't exist. And I don't think there was anything to it, but nonetheless, there was an issue that happened. But really the third factor, and I think is most important, is that none of us have ever been through this before, in that, the DCCC came in there and just, laid to waste Rocky Chavez. And again, Richard can speak to that point, but I was down there the weekend before the election, and the advertising, the radio and the TV that they did on it was just devastating, ironically, for voting for things that Democrats would want Rocky to have voted for, but the DCCC didn't care about that. So I think it was the culmination of those things, but I think what we never really anticipated was that level of spending, which probably depressed the Republican vote and left Phil, in third place.
Well, I'll also chime in. Oh, go ahead.
If I could, since Marty threw me under the bus, I won't return the favor, but I do want to point out that on the Republican side, I mean, this to me was an abject failure. Marty's nice and respectful about it. I'm more blatant about it. The Republicans absolutely blew it. This happened to the Democrats a few years ago when they were embarrassed when they lost a congressional race because they weren't prepared to do the same thing. There should never allow that to happen in a district that's yours to not even get a candidate in the runoff. And the only one who, from my review of it, was Marty, who took some leadership in making some things happen. There should have been a bigger play there, and there was not. And so, I mean, you only have ourselves to blame when that happens.
So
Yeah,
Bill gets to be the genius now. Go ahead.
No, well, I always say better to be lucky than good. I take the onus off of you guys. We're tracking that race, and I think with the speed that the Democratic Party had employed in seeing an opening and exploiting it with some mail against Graham, I think when we had seen that the Republican Party had started attacking Warren and Horvath, we realized that our data looked the same as your data, and you guys were scared about the same things we were optimistic about. And with that, then we acted relatively quickly, upon the luck of the candidate, the Republican candidate, having made a major misstep at the exact perfect time when the vote by mail ballots were hitting, I believe, and that was able to peel off votes from there. So as we talk about data and the math in this district really, in the general wasn't looking that good, but and we can try to extrapolate where things are going, but both the Republicans and the Democrats, if we're good at being nimble and being prepared to exploit opportunities, that's how the races are going to be different. On a kind of converse, just because some of the math looks great doesn't mean we won't mess it up, just, like the other side would.
So going back to Kirsten, there's a lot of discussions over transforming messaging. Basically, the electorate is changing, voter registration is low, and Republicans need to do something to get in touch with new voters. So a lot of emphasis has been made in the Assembly about New Way California. How do you think New Way California performed in this primary election, and is that something that the California GOP could look at to try to do a rebalance?
Sure. I think there's at least a couple of us in the room who are New Way California board members and excited about the opportunities that provides and daunted by the challenges that it requires us to overcome. But in terms of its performance in the primary, I think it's too premature to really speak to that. Thus far, New Way is not playing in elections. That is a long-term goal, to be able to endorse and fund candidates. But at this point, we really haven't gone into that space yet. I think the opportunity is, as we spoke to earlier, as there's a rapidly growing percentage of NPP voters in California, it's showing most people are fed up. Bill spoke to this as it relates to even voter fatigue. They don't want to talk to anybody about politics. They're just exhausted by it all. They want real results from real leaders who will talk about real issues that they're facing every day, instead of just the political rhetoric and the drama and the lack of civility and hostility that makes them feel very uncomfortable. And so I think it provides a great opportunity and a platform for what we call New Way leaders to speak to people about the real struggles they're facing in this state, whether it's being able to have enough money to send your kid to soccer camp, or to send your kid to college, or even to buy groceries and get to work. There are real challenges facing a vast number of people in California, and they just want leaders who will speak to those real issues. And so the challenges before us is we have to figure out how to put together a fundraising plan, how to organize a structure. They really, at this point, need to put together an organized, paid structure to be able to provide focus. There's an exciting new aspect of New Way that will be launched later this month that we're excited about, but we're really just in the early stages of forming and figuring out how we can come alongside those who would consider themselves center-right and figure out how to really have balance in this state again, where more people's voices are being heard, where their challenges are being addressed. And so I think there is a great opportunity for New Way to fill that void. And over the long term, if we're successful, then we will have the resources, the manpower, the ability to start playing in elections and hopefully making a difference so things like in 8076 don't happen again.
Thank you. So a lot of situations happen. I mean, some races seem off the table, for Democrats in November. Given the sort of results of the primary with Valadeo, what impact does that have on 8032 Salas, Bill?
We're watching that closely. It's hard to tell. I mean, primary elections are a lot different than general elections. The dynamics are a lot different. We've got a lot of months to go, so if we're at war with North Korea or Canada, who knows how that affects things. I think both sides have to just be nimble enough to adjust as we go through, because it's not just math. I mean, and I think that if anybody here has cracked the voter turnout mystery, I'd love to talk to them, because it changes every cycle, and it's not static. We go through all the science of like behavioral science and social pressure, but we also have to know that the voters adapt too. So as we move away from one thing and move to text messaging, whatever, they're adjusting as we're going. So even though it worked one cycle ago, or even in the primary, it may not work this cycle. For example, predictive dialers were the big thing in the last several cycles, but now the voters have figured it out, and they're not picking up. So how do you adjust to that? And I think that a lot of stuff is still in play, and ultimately what it comes down to is we're in races like that, we're fairly equally matched, and it'll be a game of execution.
I would agree with the math piece. I think the Central Valley, more than any other region of the state, shows that elections aren't just about math, and in fact really aren't about math in many areas of the state, because nowhere is Democrat registration higher than in parts of the Central Valley, including that Rudy Salas seat, and even David Valledeo's seat, where Dem registration is in the high 40s, I believe. And yet they sail through their elections. And so it shows that geography really matters. Messaging has to be very, very different. And one would think on the natural, Rudy Salas, a 3-term incumbent, he can't possibly be vulnerable. But with the David Valledeo victory there, and DCCC not having as much of a need to be active there, with Justin Mendez being the opponent, who has been the desired opponent by the party ever since it was an open seat running this time, that seat is seriously in play. And it does show that we have to be more sophisticated than just looking at the math and the numbers in elections in California.
Okay. Another hot topic has been the open primary. Marty, should the election results and voter registration trends cause Republicans and Democrats to rethink the open primary?
Well, I think that it constantly will be reviewed. I mean, from the Cal Chamber perspective, we supported Proposition 14. Cassandra personally won that race, I believe, but she, but I think it's by and large been a very good system. I mean, really there were 3 reforms, and I saw some of this on social media somewhere, but I was really the top 2 primary, the change in the redistricting, and then the extension of the term limits. And I think those 3 reforms have, by and large, benefited the people of California. I do think there is an opportunity for more moderation in the legislature. I mean, Chris Tapio's here. I saw you identify about 22 moderate Democrats now in the Assembly. Cal Chamber is proud to have supported and helped on most of those races. So I think that over time the top 2 system is going to work very well. It may not help party leaders. No offense to the chairman here, but that's not what it was designed to do, and I think it's a good system.
I would admit the State Building Trades Council also was a strong supporter of the open primary. We were twisting some arms in the legislature late at night to try to get that passed. Bill Vaughn, do you want to have a rebuttal or an add-on to that?
I don't know. I mean, it would make my life easier, I would say, if we didn't have the open primary, but I mean, when you look at 76, well, maybe it's not so bad. I don't know.
I agree, and then some of the policies that have been adopted by the legislature have been progressive policies and so forth, so sort of to be determined, right, as to what the actual effect was. This question is for Richard. In what areas does having John Cox at the top of the Republican ticket help out the most? In what races?
Well, there's a lot of Republicans. First of all, I mean, I think the top of the ticket discussion has been going on for a long time. I'm not a big believer that is as vital as people think. I think it's great that we have Republican candidates from that standpoint, someone to point to, but really comes down to resources and winnability. Voters are pretty smart. If they see the game's over before it started, they're not going to get that motivated because that person's there. It will, I think, motivate the hardcore base, which is probably going to vote anyway, because they'll be addressing issues that they really believe in and really feel strongly about. And so I think that primarily what the Republicans need to do, I believe, and what I've been advocating for a while, is to start talking issues and let's worry about candidates for the time being, because we cannot grow as a party. We cannot grow, and until that happens, we've got to fight it out on issues where voters are on the same side as our people and our party. And so we should be out trying to fight for issues, 1 or 2 or 3 every election, and go out there and campaign hard on those. I think we'll have more success electing people because they'll be talking about the issues that matter to voters. But also, at the very least, we're pushing public policy. I think that that would be better served. The gas tax is an example of a ballot measure that's going to be on. I think that will have a greater impact on turnout than a Republican candidate at running for, Attorney General or whatnot. And I think there could have been more. There could be more that they could put on there every year. So I think the voters are going to be pretty discerning. I think Republicans turn out pretty good numbers for the most part in the gubernatorial race, unless we see different from the Democrats. We will be a higher percentage of the market in November. Anyway, we should be pushing things that we can actually win and get policy differences.
I think what John Cox can do, I agree, I think the jury's out on whether that improves or increases Republican turnout, but I think what it does do is it activates the activists. And I think it will activate a greater volunteer force and mobilize a volunteer force that then can be active in the target races on the ground across the state. So overall turnout, not so sure, but I do think it activates a volunteer mobilization force that otherwise might just stay home.
So here's an open question, 80-72. So to talk about strategy and messaging, here's one of those races that's going to be Josh Lowenthal against Tyler Deep.
We'll see. Well, I mean, we haven't assessed the damage from the murder-suicide that kind of occurred in the primary. I actually had to create a Google folder for all the mail that was going back and forth just for my own edification. Again, primary races are a lot different than general races. I think coastal voters are different than your typical kind of inland voters. Josh didn't run much of a campaign, so we have yet to see, where the appetite of the voters are going to be going into this. So I think it's a big question mark, and I think that the general election is going to be a completely different race than what you saw in the primary.
I'd agree with that. I think the other externality there is what happens in the House race. Rohrabacher is going to have a very tough re-election. I think that the DCCC is going to smell blood, and so they're going to put a lot of resources in that race. I mean, really their best opportunities for pickups in California are the ISIS seat and probably the Rohrabacher seat. Would you agree, Tony? And so, there'll be a lot of activity there, and that'll work both ways. Again, I think part of the problem that Republicans had and didn't, adequately anticipate with all the DCCC activity, there was really no Republican response except for the candidates and their campaigns. And so, again, that left, Rocky Chavez vulnerable. It left Philip Graham vulnerable, and now in the general election, especially in the case of 87-82, we'll have a much more traditional Democrat versus Republican matchup. There'll be lots of activity, campaigns, organizational activity, lots of money being spent, and so presumably, if Republicans respond and turn out and vote in usual numbers, then I think, Deep should be able to hold on to that seat.
Yeah, I think he should be fine, with the caveat of the DCCC, yet to see what spillover that will have, but I think a lot of people forget that total Republican vote in the primary in that seat was 63%. It's pretty hard to close an over 13% gap between June and November. So we'll see what happens as a result of the DCCC activity, but I'd say odds are pretty strong that Tyler Deep's the next to someone in there.
Is that the same situation or a lot different in 80-40 with this former Steinhorst, will be former Steinhorst seat?
I think that's a tough one.
You don't have the DCCC basically being as active there, and that would more
True, so arguably that could help, but that's just a tough seat, and without an incumbent there, I mean, neither of us have an incumbent there. I don't know why I keep saying us, I resigned in October. Old habits are hard to break. But I just think that's a really difficult seat from a demographic standpoint, from a messaging standpoint, and the Democrats have a fantastic, well-known, popular candidate. Henry Nickel's a great candidate too, Henry Gomez Nickel, but it's going to be a tough one.
A big registration advantage. It's, I think, a +8 district right now for the Democrats.
Yeah, and James Ramos represents the most conservative supervisorial seat in San Bernardino County, so he's got a lot of crossover appeal. I think one of his chief of staff worked for a Republican member as well, so I mean, he's got a lot of crossover. He also has resources. I mean, the bigger context of what's going to happen is you know, if there is some limit to money, where can you all play at, and where do you make decisions of you know, how you divide up those resources on the assembly side, because we got lucky with 76. I mean, and we got lucky on the cheap on that one. So I mean, it's not going to be a $2 million fight, which means that there's money that goes elsewhere.
That's right. I'm not sure how we are on time. Do you want to open up to the audience for any questions? Does anyone have any questions of the panelists? Yes, sir.
Yeah, are the recent rulings on sports gambling and everything creating any interest by casinos in opening up gambling in California?
That's interesting. We may not be the right panel for that. Right?
Something like Flavor's legislative races.
Well, they have. I mean, the tribes have traditionally played heavily in legislative campaigns, card clubs. I believe less so. I think they're more focused at local level.
Talk about the 5 counties where we tried the change in voting and the mail-in ballots. Did you change strategies as a result? Did you see a difference? Sacramento's going to be 45, 46%, apparently. Right? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah,
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, there's a, was it a SB 450 changed, basically, ultimately, in California, we're going to do away with precinct voting over time. There will be a mail ballot, everybody will get a mail ballot, and then you have the option of either voting that ballot, I think, 7-10 days in advance at remote locations and/or mailing it in, or then turning it in. There's like drop boxes where you can turn it in. I think that, you know, it'll work fine. I've been on a task force with Secretary of State's office, you know, for over a year, and you know, I think they're doing an excellent job in terms of planning it out. I don't see a huge, I mean, there's some concern in ethnic communities. Apparently, ethnic voters, particularly Latinos, they like to vote at the polls, so how do they make this transition? So there's a lot of, you know, work being done to contemplate that. The only thing that I'll say is, just as a consumer of the product, I've always been a poll voter, never an absentee voter, and when I got the ballot and was filling it out on Memorial Day weekend, I started looking through the voter pamphlet, and it was confusing, and I even know the law, supposedly. And in terms of where I go to turn it in, what day can I vote here? Do I turn it in at the library? Fortunately, it was early enough that, you know, putting the stamp on, although it was a 50.
71 cents?
Yes, yeah, 71-cent stamp. So I think that there's, you know, factors there that, you know, will confuse voters, but, you know, through the pilot process, I think they'll work it out.
Yeah, one thing, I mean, there were more absentee ballot mailed out than ever. And if you look at the numbers, there are a lot of people who have absentee ballots in their hand that didn't return them. And so I believe it's, again, human nature. They have to be motivated to do it. Having